God gives us real inheritances, and yet we feel it's not big enough. We feel like there's something that is not complete. It is not enough, right? And this is something that I want to highlight in this episode, that faith can receive a promise and still refuse to possess it fully. And in Joshua chapter 17, we're going to unpack the daughters of Zelophehad, Joseph's descendants, incomplete conquest, and the call to press into what God has already given. And I'll give you one immediate action to help you stop shrinking back from your promise in this episode of Biblical Unlocks. This show is designed to help build your habit of reading the Bible, understanding the Bible, and applying it in your daily life. If you enjoy episodes like this, please consider following and rating the show. It's free, it helps me out a lot, and you can always change your mind later. Now, let's get a little bit of context into the chapter. So Joshua chapter 17 is going to continue the land allotments with Manasseh's inheritance, including the daughters of Zelophehad, whose case protects their right to land. The chapter is then going to note that Manasseh did not fully drive out the Canaanites, and is finally going to record Joseph's descendants complaining that their territory is too small, and Joshua is going to answer by telling them to clear the forested hill country and face the Canaanites with faith. So the chapter is about inheritance, justice, and the temptation to call God's gift too small before you have fully possessed it. Okay, so we're going to read verses 1 to 6. The focus here is going to be on the daughters of Zelophehad and them receiving the inheritance. And my question for you to stay engaged is, why does Scripture make room for daughters when the land is being divided? Let's see, verse 1. Then allotment was made to the tribe of Manasseh, for he was the firstborn of Joseph. To Machir, the firstborn of Manasseh, the father of Gilead, were allotted Gilead and Bashan, because he was warrior, and allotments were made to the rest of the tribe of Manasseh by their families: Abiezer, Helek, Azriel, Shechem, Hepher, and Shemida. These were the male descendants of Manasseh, son of Joseph, by their families. Now Zelophehad, son of Hepher, son of Gilead, son of Machir, son of Manasseh, had no sons but only daughters, and these are the names of his daughters: Mahlah, Noah, Hoglah, Milcah, and Tirzah. They came before the priest Eleazar and Joshua son of Nun and the leaders and said, "The Lord commanded Moses to give us an inheritance along with our male kin." So according to the commandment of the Lord, he gave them an inheritance among the kinsmen of their father. Thus there fell to Manasseh 10 portions, beside the land of Gilead and Bashan, which is on the other side of the Jordan. And because the daughters of Manasseh received an inheritance along with his sons, the land of Gilead was allotted to the rest of the Manassites. Biblical unlock number 1. Everything is related. So what we're seeing here is the daughters of Zelophehad, and we've already seen this before. Numbers chapter 27. If you want to see that video, please feel free to check it out. But I explained there as well. We're going back to the daughters of Zelophehad again because inheritance in Israel is not just about the sons and military strength, right? God had already established that these daughters, we saw this in Numbers chapter 27, should not be erased just because their father had no sons, and their case shows something, that covenant justice protects the vulnerable, and that God's promise is careful, not careless. So, justice in this sense is a sign that God remembers the lowly. In this case, especially in this particularly patriarchal society, God established that the daughters should not be erased just because of their particular circumstance. No. Okay, so that's important. The covenant faithfulness is here to protect those who might be overlooked. And this is important as well because this is right in the middle of land allotment. Okay, so the territory, the land, it's not just a particular territory, it's a family future. The daughter's inheritance is proving that God's gift it's meant to sustain their households. It's not just some sort of tribal abstract thing. Their place in the chapter reminds us that biblical justice and the covenant, they both go together. So God's care is reaching into the practical life and the family order, and it's reminding us that mercy belongs even in the mechanisms of inheritance. The inheritance that we're seeing here have to obey by that same level of justice and mercy that we've come to know God by. Okay, so let's read verses 7 to 13 now. Focus here is going to be Manasseh's borders and incomplete conquest. And my question for you is, what does it mean to inherit land but to still leave enemies in place? Verse 7, the territories of Manasseh reached from Asher to Michmethah, which is east of Shechem. Then the boundary goes along southward to the inhabitants of En-Tappuah. The land of Tappuah belonged to Manasseh, but the town of Tappuah on the boundary of Manasseh belonged to the Ephraimites. Then the boundary went down to the Wadi Kana, the towns here to the south of the Wadi, among the towns of Manasseh, belong to Ephraim. Then the boundary of Manasseh goes along the north side of the Wadi and ends at the sea. The land to the south is Ephraim's, and that to the north is Manasseh's, with the sea forming its boundary. On the north Asher is reached, and on the east Issachar. Within Issachar and Asher, Manasseh had Bethshean and its villages, Ibleam and its villages, the inhabitants of Dor and its villages, the inhabitants of Endor and its villages, the inhabitants of Tanakh and its villages, and the inhabitants of Megiddo and its villages. The third is Naphath. Yet the Manassites could not take possession of those towns, but the Canaanites continued to live in that land. But when the Israelites grew strong, they put the Canaanites to forced labor, but did not utterly drive them out. So we're seeing a little bit of a continuation from Joshua chapter 16 here, right? So it's implying something, right? So Manasseh's borders are incomplete, all right? Or what we're saying is we have Manasseh's borders and there was an incomplete conquest. So what does it mean that Manasseh still lived alongside the Canaanites? It means something that we talked about in the previous episode, that partial possession can hide partial obedience. So what is happening here is the tribe has land, but it doesn't have full peace. They have inheritance, but they also have compromise. So this chapter is exposing something. There's a gap between the promise that is received and the promise that is fully inhabited, right? So here we have incomplete obedience. We sort of have that situation where we're 1 foot in, 1 foot out. That is a problem, because when we have incomplete obedience, we're leaving the soul vulnerable to something. So we have a compromise here. And when we have a compromise, that means that it does not stay contained. It actually is going to shape the future, because now we're allowing something into our soul that we shouldn't have in the first place. So why doesn't the text just celebrate the land and move on? Is because that unresolved Canaanite presence matters. The chapter is actually refusing to romanticize progress, because God's people can be truly blessed and still leave room for trouble if they do not press through in courage and obedience. So we see spiritual life as an ongoing movement. It's not just some settled complacency. So faith must keep advancing into what God has already given. Okay, let's read verses 14 to 18 now. The focus here is going to be Joseph's descendants and their complaints, and Joshua is going to tell them to press in. And my question for you to stay engaged is, why do you think, or why do people often think, that God's gift is too small before they've fully occupied it? Verse 14, the tribes of Joseph spoke to Joshua, saying, why have you given me but one lot and one portion as an inheritance, since we are a numerous people, whom all along the Lord has blessed? And Joshua said to them, if you are a numerous people, go up to the forest and clear ground there for yourselves, in the land of the Perizzites and the Rephaim, since the hill country of Ephraim is too narrow for you. The tribe of Joseph said, the hill country is not enough for us, yet all the Canaanites who live in the plain have chariots of iron, both those in Bethshean and its villages, and those in the valley of Jezreel. Then Joshua said to the house of Joseph, to Ephraim and Manasseh, you are indeed a numerous people, and have great power. You shall not have one lot only, but the hill country shall be yours, for though it is a forest, you shall clear it, and possess it to its farthest borders. For you shall drive out the Canaanites, though they have chariots of iron, and though they are strong. Alright, final biblical unlock. So why did the Joseph tribe say their portion is too small? You'll see that in the very beginning of this section. And the reason is because, entitlement, right? Entitlement can make a real gift actually feel insufficient. The grass is always greener on the other side, as they say. So because entitlement can make this gift feel less than, right? We have a situation where they have strength, they have numbers, they have inheritance, but instead of pressing into what God has given, they focus on what they think they lack. So their complaint exposes fear dressed up as a practical concern. So disordered desire is actually what makes people blind to what they already have. So again, gratitude and courage are needed together. So Joshua tells them to clear the forest and fight the Canaanites. So the answer here is, or the answer to, we do not have enough room, is often then possess more faithfully. So Joshua is telling them, or is actually not denying the difficulty, but instead he's redirecting them towards some kind of action. The land is theirs, but they must work, clear, and contend for what God has already assigned. And the final thing, we see the iron chariots, right? The iron chariots. Is that some kind of threat? Isn't that a real threat? And the answer is yes, and Joshua does not pretend otherwise. But the fear of the chariots is exactly the point. The tribe must learn that God's gift includes the strength to confront what looks intimidating. So the chapter ends by refusing the language of defeat. So, visible strength is not the final measure of reality. It is remembering that the size of the obstacle does not define the size of God's promise. Okay, let's see how this chapter fulfills Jesus Christ. Okay, so Joshua chapter 17 shows us how we can see a people who have a real inheritance, but they still need courage to fully possess it. But in Christ, this tension actually remains. Believers, we as Christians, we receive real blessing, we receive real belonging, we receive real hope, and yet we must still press into the fullness of what God has given, because Jesus does not only assign us an inheritance, He gives us strength for the hard places, the forest clearings, and the iron chariots that seem to block the way. As we read in the second letter of Paul to the Corinthians, chapter 12, verse 9, "But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for power is made perfect in weakness. So I will boast all the more gladly of my weakness, so that the power of Christ may dwell within me." So that shows us what Joshua chapter 17 is all about. That's the gospel courage. What feels too small or too hard is exactly where God's power is shown. Alright, so how can we apply the chapter in our everyday life? Where has God already given you ground, but you have not fully occupied it? And I think that's where you can take one step into that space this week. That is to say, there are places where God has given you blessings. There are things that God has given you. There are things that you need to be grateful of, but you simply are not. So that is something that you can work on. And the second thing is, you can catch yourself saying, I do not have enough, and you need to replace it with something. It's not about changing everything about yourself. It's about replacing the small habits that we give into day in and day out. So what would faithfulness look like in this particular instance? When you say, I do not have enough, what has God already given me? When you feel that, I feel this weight on my chest, I can't get through this particular situation, what would faithfulness look like in this particular instance? Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid or dismayed, for the Lord your God walks with you everywhere you go. And that is precisely what we need. Alright, so that's it for this episode of Biblical Unlocks. We learnt that the daughters of Zelophehad show that covenant inheritance includes justice for the vulnerable. Manasseh's partial conquest warns that possession without full obedience actually leaves danger in place. Joseph's descendants reveal how easily a real gift can feel insufficient when your faith is shrinking. Joshua answers complaints with commission, clear the forest and face the challenge, and God's strength is shown precisely where our weakness feels biggest. So that's it for this episode of Biblical Unlocks. If you enjoyed this episode, please feel free to rate the show and follow. It's free, it helps me out a lot, and you can always change your mind later. Otherwise, just have a blessed day. And remember, if you're not in your word, you're in your feelings. Godspeed.